Hello, hello, New Haven, and happy Friday. We're back with Arts Respond on WNHH Community Radio. Arts Respond is a joint project between WNHH and the Arts Council of Greater New Haven. I'm Lucy Gellman, your host, and I'm really excited today to be joined by Mei Yi. She is the rabbi in training, rabbinical student. Do you have one that you prefer?
Rabbi in training is fine. Yeah.
And I would say absolutely spiritual guide and leader with Mending Minyan, Havurah that is working to decouple Judaism from Zionism in New Haven. In the interest of full disclosure, I feel like I have to say this as someone who's also a reporter. I am a very happy member of Mending Minyan. But also as someone who is a reporter, I wanted to get the word out about this beautiful community that has been growing in New Haven for the past 4 years. And May, you've been an instrumental part of that, increasingly so. And now you live in New Haven. So we're happy to have you here. So I do want to go into the Wayback Machine and talk a little bit about your own history and your own relationship with Judaism. But before we do that, I'm wondering if we can tell folks, because we have a very general listenership, what a Havurah is, because some people might be listening and say, I don't recognize that terminology.
Yeah. So I would say that a Havurah is like a small group community of Jews. So someone might be familiar with the concept of a synagogue, right, which has a building and a pretty set structure. Yeah. And with a Havurah and with our Havurah in particular, we're a bit more home-based, we're a bit more diasporic. We move from people's homes to people's backyards, to different community spaces around town. And I would say that we're perhaps a bit smaller than a synagogue that may come to mind for you. Yeah.
Although it's interesting because I think in the same way that some church communities that some listeners may recognize are shrinking, some synagogues, I've been surprised by how low attendance can be on just a Friday night or a Saturday morning for a Shabbat service, as opposed to I call them like the big ones, the high holidays. So which usually pack the house, but yeah, but I've noticed that as well. And, and you said home-based, but the other word you said is diasporic. And I think one thing that Mending Minyan has tried to do, and I would say has done pretty successfully, is be a home base for Jews who maybe don't feel safe or welcome in other synagogues. And I'm wondering, and other congregations. And I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about that, because one thing that I know attracted me to Mending Minyan as someone who is who is white and heterosexual and cisgender, but also not totally able-bodied, was that it was an extremely welcoming group of Jews who said, you can sort of come as you are. And so if you don't fit into this mainstream idea of what Judaism is and what kind of body or skin color someone has to have to practice Judaism, you're welcome here.
Yeah, sometimes I say that Mending Minyan serves Jews on the margins, but I say that in our current context. I think many of us exist on the Jewish margins now and today, and it's my hope that what are the margins today become the center soon, God willing. But yes, I would say that Mending Minyan is largely comprised of folks with marginalized identities. We have queer people and trans and non-binary people, folks with disabilities. We have elders and children. We have people of color, and I'm sure we'll get into this, but I think it's because we have clear values that make us a safe community for those people and that draw those people to us. I also think that there's no community like ours that I've learned about so far, we'll say, in the greater New Haven area. And so I think it's so important for people to be able to feel seen in their Jewish practice. Just last weekend, we had a little meet and greet with me in someone's backyard, and someone was speaking about the offerings and began to speak about conversion and began telling their story about how they didn't grow up Jewish enough and this and that. And before I could even respond to them to say that, sure, conversion is an option within our community, I had to say, but I see you as Jewish. And to be clear, for all of us, everyone here is completely Jewish, right? You all are very Jewish in my eyes. And we can get into my story too, in that for many folks would not see me as completely Jewish or Jewish enough. And so at Mending Minyan, it is my deep belief that every person, however they come, however they show up, is completely Jewish enough, whether that means they have a Jewish parent and which parent is Jewish, whether they've just been practicing, whether they're interested, however you come, however you show up. I like to say that you're welcome with all parts of you, and I hope that you're not only welcome, but you're safe in this community.
Yeah. So I do want to get into Mending Minyan's mission, too many M's for a Friday, which you mentioned, but I do want to go into the Wayback Machine and talk about your own relationship with Judaism, which has evolved in a very beautiful way, but also a way that you've been open about. People have pushed back against you. And I think there's some violence there, right? So I'm wondering if you can talk about that.
Yeah. So I grew up in a secular home in a small town in Maine and came to my Jewish roots after high school. At the time, I was taking a gap year, and I was kind of asking myself these big life questions that I think we ask ourselves when we're fresh out of high school. And I'm asking myself, who am I? And I say, well, I'm half Chinese. I'm Asian American. That's how I've always identified since I was a little girl. And for the first time, I said, well, if I'm half Chinese, if I'm half Asian American, what's the other half? And I came to saying that the other half was Jewish. My father's parents are Holocaust survivors. My grandfather was incarcerated at the concentration camp at Dachau. And so I was like, oh, I'm half Jewish. Well, what should I do about that? Like, how am I going to embrace this identity? What I find very lucky for myself is that I came to Judaism as an adult, which means to me that I was able to come to Judaism from both a political and a spiritual perspective at the same time. And so from pretty early on, my politics were that of non and anti-Zionism. And as we've said, I'm Chinese American. So throughout this year after high school and throughout undergrad, I tried really hard to get involved in Jewish life. I tried going to Hillel. I tried going to Chabad. I connected with rabbis, at home in Maine, and I asked them to connect me to rabbis in Michigan, where I was going to school. And I would say, like, hey, can you just find me a family who would be willing to maybe host me for a Shabbat dinner? And the answer was no, time and time again. No one was willing to host me for a meal. When I tried to go to a service, sometimes I would be told, no, you just cannot enter these doors. Even once upon a time, I was with my best friend who is brunette and Christian, and she was welcome to enter. But I, as someone with Jewish heritage, was not. And this was just my experience over and over again. And I felt that I kept like knocking on these doors. And I'm like, let me in, let me in. Like, I want to know what Judaism is about. And the answer was always no. And so, fast forward or not, when I start rabbinical school, I hadn't done a Shabbat. The only Shabbat service that I had done was sitting on my bed in my dorm room in undergrad, live streaming a Shabbat service from Central Synagogue in New York City and having no idea what was going on, right? And I had never physically been in person to a synagogue. I had never been a part of a Minyan, right? A group of 10 Jews. I had never experienced a Shabbat meal. I experienced my first Rosh Hashanah and my first Yom Kippur from the bima, from the pulpit. I experienced my first Passover Seder as a rabbinical student. So all of these experiences that are pretty central to being a Jew, I was only able to experience when I entered the doors of rabbinical school.
And I mean, I also want to ask you how much of that, and it sounds like a great deal, has to do with this conflation that is incorrect in this country and has everything to do with white supremacy of Judaism, right? Or the right kind of Judaism with whiteness. Because I think that European Ashkenazi Jews in the mid to second half of the 20th century were sort of the last major group to graduate. And I use that in sort of air quotes because I don't believe in model minority myths, and I think they're extremely harmful, but to graduate from model minority status into whiteness. And for you, it sounds like this is a lot of what you were experiencing, that oh, if you're not white, brunette, then you're not the right kind of Jew. I'm not saying I think any kind of Jew is the right kind of Jew.
Yeah, totally. I think within American Jewish culture, there's a lot of Ashken normativity. So Ashken normativity and whiteness. So I think a lot of the times when I was showing up to spaces looking Asian, people would just be like, "You don't belong here. Why are you trying to tell me that you're Jewish when clearly you're not?" And I think there's work being done, in the larger Jewish community to become more inclusive and become more accepting of interracial families and of Jews of color at large, however, whatever their Jewish background is. But yeah, definitely a lot of white supremacy, a lot of Ashken normativity defining, what a Jew looks like and what a Jew believes in, how a Jew should practice, and all these ways a Jew should, in air quotes, be.
So if you're just joining us on WNHHLP 103.5 FM New Haven, this is Arts Respond with Lucy Gellman. I'm very excited that today my guest is Mei Yi, a rabbinical student, and I would absolutely say spiritual leader. I feel good about that. If you feel good about that, Mei, with Mending Minyan, a Havurah, a growing Havurah in New Haven, working to decouple Zionism from Judaism. So Mei, you actually, one of the things you mentioned was Ashken normativity, which is a term that, despite its violence, I really appreciate, just because it is like exactly what it says, right? And I think that that's a really good segue into what decoupling Judaism from Zionism means. And in some ways, we should probably have 4 to 7 hours for this, and maybe like a book club break in between, but we don't have that. And one of the things I was thinking about, and I talked to you about a little bit last week when we sat down and chatted about Judaism, was the fact that for me it has become increasingly clear that like there was no unifying vision at the beginning of this Zionist project anyway. And if you watch a film like Shoah, which is more than 9 hours, so I don't recommend it in like maybe one sitting, you see that. You see that everyone sort of had a different thing in mind. But I have also found, and in my own sort of Jewish and spiritual learning or unlearning, that there is real hesitancy to talk about the displacement of people from their land. And the like replicated patterns of oppression that were perhaps put on Jews, especially European Jews, who then went on to this thing that is now recognized as Israel. That was extremely inarticulate, but I think it's a starting place for us.
Yeah. Zionism, Judaism, decoupling Zionism from Judaism. I guess the first thing that I want to say is that Judaism and Zionism have not always been coupled. And so I think that's how we get to Mending Minyan. I think it's with the rise of Zionism, and especially of political Zionism, with the creation of the state of Israel, where we really get this conflation of a spiritual practice and of a political movement. Um, and I think that's where Mending Minyan shows up to say, hey, these two things have not always been connected, and we want to figure out what is Judaism? What's at the root of this? What is the Jewish practice when we pull away all of the Zionism that really has taken over in many ways, right? Like, why, when I go to, a more traditional synagogue, is there an Israeli flag and most often an American flag on the bima, on the pulpit? I don't want to see flags. I don't want there to be nationalism in a space where I pray, in a space where I'm supposed to be spiritual. Why, if I go to such a shul, to such a synagogue, am I being invited or asked to stand in the middle of the service for the prayer for the state of Israel? Again, no nationalism in my spiritual space, please.
Yeah, which is very I feel like that's not unique to these spaces. This was a secular space, not a spiritual space. But last night I was attending a gala for Puerto Ricans United, and there was a lot of really rah America, which is great, but it was so much, and that's a lot. And then when you walk into a spiritual place, I think that ritual, you're absolutely right, so predates Zionism, because Zionism is a relatively recent intervention. And so what does that look like? That practice of decoupling, what does that look like when you are when you're practicing with this Havurah? I will say a lot of it is and has been lay-led. And one thing I love about you is you don't say, okay, I'm going to stand up here and be the arbiter of, taste and religion and what we do in this space. I'm going to ask people what prayers they want to say, and that might change depending on on what Shabbat it is or where we're practicing. I'm going to ask people if they feel like a certain affinity to a certain prayer, and if they want to practice it. I'm not going to correct people if they mess up their Hebrew, which I will say I really appreciate, because I always muck up something inevitably. So what does that look like in practice for you?
Yeah, it's a huge project. And I think I'm evolving in my understanding and in my practice of what that looks like. And I hope to continue in that evolvement and in exploring with Mending Minyan what that looks like for our community. So part of it is that, as I said, on a meta level, stripping away the Zionism to find the core of our practice. A lot of the time, I think that means studying ritual, studying liturgy, studying traditional Jewish texts in the context in which they were originally written, years and years predating the founding of the state of Israel. What we find is that Israel and the language of Zion, of Zion, is all over that. And so we start to wrestle with that, because what does it mean for those words to be there? Like, what is my experience when I read the word Yisrael, Israel, or Zion, Zion in my liturgy? Unfortunately, I'm unable to separate those words from what in the rest of my life I know them as. When I see the word Israel, I unfortunately am thinking of a political nation state. And so we've been on this journey as a community. I think we really started this last year around the high holidays in thinking about ways that we might transform our liturgy. And at the time, I came up with 3 ideas that I still play with but I'm excited for this to evolve. So one of the ways is to just remove language and remove liturgy and remove language that is problematic. So sometimes this is the word Israel, but sometimes it's like homophobic language in our liturgy and other things that are really problematic. So sometimes to me, the answer is to remove it. Sometimes the answer is to replace it. So let's take, for example, the Shema, right? One of the central prayers of the Jewish practice, which begins Shema Yisrael, listen Israel. Well, what is that saying? What does Israel mean in that context? Israel means my people. Shema Yisrael, listen, my people. So in my own personal practice, when I say the Shema, I say Shema Ami. Listen, my people. And the context, what I'm saying is the same, but I'm no longer using what I find to be a triggering word, which is Yisrael. Other ways that I think we do this work is by rewriting liturgy. When something is just too hard, too complicated, too problematic, really, to wrestle with, I find myself rewriting. I find myself studying the thing to understand and try to give honor to its original context and meaning, and then rewriting it. And I often find that when I rewrite things, my community members feel seen because I can take the messages and lift up the identities in my community and the experiences, lived experiences in my community. And I would say that the final way I came up with last year to do this wrestling is to wrestle in live time. And we did that with one of our Torah readings during the high holidays last year. And we named all the ways in which it was problematic when we said as a community, we're going to do this, right? So we're going to experience all of the ways because the way that we wrestle, the way that we decouple Judaism from Zionism doesn't always mean running away. And yeah, as I said, it's evolving. And I think another space that we're really exploring and beginning to dive into this year is what is the intersection of the political and the spiritual, right? So this work of decoupling Judaism from Zionism, is that a political project? Is that a spiritual project? And how do we make sure that we're not conflating the two? How do we make sure that we don't feel like we're showing up to a protest every week because we're so engaged in this work? So these are live questions for us, especially in this moment.
Well, I also want to ask about the education that has sort of laid this foundation for you, especially after such an alienating experience with or introduction to your own Judaism. So I know that, for instance, Rabbi Brant Rosen has been an extremely important figure in your life, and I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about that work, but also your work as a student, because I think a lot of people, in the same way that they may be listening to this and they think there's one way to be an American Jew, they may think that rabbinical school means one thing, and actually it means a whole multiplicity of things in this country.
Yeah, so definitely big shout out to Rabbi Brant Rosen, and especially for allowing me to be the intern at his synagogue at Tzedek Chicago during my second year of rabbinical school. Rabbi Brant Rosen is the founder of the first explicitly anti-Zionist synagogue in the country. But what I really admire about him and what I've learned from him is how to rewrite liturgy. I mean, Brant has published books of rewritten liturgy, and we borrow so much from Tzedek Chicago's Machzor High Holiday Prayer book in our services. So I'm so glad to have been connected to him kind of from the beginning of my journey. In terms of things that I've learned as a rabbinical student, I will say that I'm starting my 6th and final year at the Reconstructionist Rabbinical College. I'm completing that remotely from New Haven, Connecticut, so that I can be working with Mending Minyan. And I would say what rabbinical school has done is that it has given me the tools to study the texts in their original forms. And I would say that I have had professors and many classmates, who have sat with me and encouraged me to go further, to study these things in the original context, and then to be like, okay, and how does this make sense now? And what relevance does this have today? What relevance does this have for me as an Asian American Jew? What relevance does this have for my communities and the people that I'm serving?
And I also want to say you've been in New Haven for 8 weeks, 9 weeks at this point. You had a
Yeah, just
relationship with the
under two
city
months. Yeah.
beforehand, including an epic walk that I think covered half of the city that like different members of Mending Minyan have talked about at multiple times. So I know that you had a relationship with New Haven before you moved here. Um, but Philly is such a cool, not throwing New Haven under the bus. It is my home. It will remain my home. It's the city I love, but Philly is such a cool city. And I think there are a lot of really rad Jews there. How is this transition for you?
It's hard. I miss Philly. There's a lot of really, really bad people in Philly. And at first I thought, oh, it's just because I go to RRC that like my classmates are trans and queer and disabled, and I'm not the only person of color at school. And a majority of my professors are femme and queer, and like how cool. But that was also my experience in Philly's Jewish life at large, right? When I walked down the streets to go to shul when I was living there, one of my rabbis was a trans man. The other rabbi was a Argentinian Jew who was like a queer femme. Like how cool. And part of my work in moving to New Haven has been connecting to the Jewish community in New Haven and around us. And I'll say that it's a very different landscape than what I came from in Philly. And it makes it clear to me why Mending Minyan. And it makes me really honored to be able to work with this community and to build with this community. And I think the more that folks know about us, they flock to us. And it's just really cool to have us on the map. And like on the Eastern Seaboard, and we're close to a lot of places. Like I know people from Northampton, Massachusetts, who come and join us. And I think we will be seeing more visitors as time goes on. So the transition has not always been easy, but I'm just so thrilled about Mending Minyan. That's definitely my favorite part of New Haven so far. And just I'm looking forward to getting to know this small city and all that means.
And I will ask, so you said, and I would agree with this as someone who is often in the organizing world or writing about the organizing world, that it's maybe important to you not to roll up to a Shabbat service and have it feel like a protest. But in your time in the city, you have been doing some really thoughtful work around organizing, including the fact that you spoke at a rally spoke and sang, I will say, at a rally on the day that Roe was overturned and sort of held space for people. And so for you, I'm wondering if you can talk to us a little bit about the ways that your organizing work also informs your Judaism and is really foundational to your spiritual practice and or vice versa.
Yeah, I mean, I think my life as an activist and as an organizer and as a rabbi, and maybe even also as a musician, are really intertwined with each other. And my relationship is evolving. Like when I was living in Philly, I was like a more hardcore activist than maybe I've been in my few weeks here in New Haven, where I feel like I'm really stepping into the role of a rabbi. In in Philly, I was a student, and I was rebellious, and I went into the streets and I participated in direct actions. And when I was invited to speak at that rally when Roe was overturned, I really spent a lot of that time that day thinking, okay, what is it that people need to hear from a rabbi? What is it that I can say that someone else isn't going to be saying, right? Because you get a lot of the same facts regurgitated from different speakers. And so now I feel like I'm at a life where I'm really trying to bring those worlds together, right? And maybe to be more spiritual than I have in the past. And so at that rally, that meant for me being like, oh, I think we need a time for grief. I think we need a time to pause, to take a breath together. How many of us that day our bodies had been clenched? How many of us had been holding our breath? So I felt that it was my place to invite breath, to say to people that maybe other speakers didn't name, people with uteruses, including trans men and non-binary folks, that, hey, I see you. And I see you in your grief. I see you in your rage and in your despair and in your resolve and in whatever it may be. So I'm learning what it means to inhabit all of these roles. And I'm sure that you still will see me at a direct action in New Haven. I don't think those days are done for me. But I am beginning to think more critically about what it means to show up as a rabbi. And I'm learning what that means. And Mending Minyan is teaching me what that means. I don't know if we've said this, but Mending Minyan has only been lay-led, in its history. And by me joining, I don't want that to change. And from the very beginning, we've named that bringing on a rabbi has an inherent power dynamic. But we've named that from the start, and we will continue naming that, and we will continue talking about that. And so I think as we continue to talk about that and figure out what that means for our community, and as I figure out what my role is, I'm noticing that I can also challenge my own notions of power and what a rabbi means, because I think that's also a little different in our community. And so I think that I can actually feel a little more braver and safer in the streets, and that I'll be protected and cheered on by my congregants in a way that some other rabbis may not be.
So I want to, I do want to save time to talk about how folks can get involved with Mending Minyan if people are listening and they want to. But I do want to go back to the Z word, Zionism, for a moment and say, if someone is listening, and I know this from y'all's emails that I have received in my inbox as editor of the arts paper, I know that there are probably people listening who are not comfortable with this conversation, who may be offended or upset by this conversation. And I want to recognize that, for some folks coming to this may be a really hard and unpleasant conversation that they're hearing. But for people listening to this who say, I'm ready to interrogate my own set of beliefs, because I know that for me, initially, I had to do that. I was a kid who was raised in Hebrew school with a very sort of one viewpoint. And in Hebrew school, we made hummus and we made falafel, and we were told that those were Israeli foods made by only Israeli people. And so I had to do a lot of unlearning, and I did that, I would say, probably like after college. And I was someone who could walk into a Hillel and be welcome just as I was. So if people are hearing this and saying, okay, maybe I'm not ready to think about that, and that's okay, you can step away from this conversation. But maybe I am ready to think about my own system of beliefs and to push it a little bit, and maybe I am interested in getting involved. What would your advice be for them? Because this is so big, and I think there's so much unlearning that has to happen.
Yeah, well, first I want to say, if you're listening to this conversation and you're uncomfortable with it, thank you so much for listening, and thank you so much for staying, and for engaging in the conversation in this way. And I just want to say that I know it's hard, and that you're so welcome, and you're not alone on this journey in unlearning Zionism. There are so many people who have been indoctrinated in their, early days in Hebrew school, in synagogue. And there are so many people who have had to do that work of unlearning. It's not easy. I can't speak from personal experience, but I've talked to a lot of people and it's not easy. So what I want to say to you is that you're not alone in this work, and that, I'm happy to help connect you to other people who've been on this journey, to connect you to resources where you can listen and study and engage with people who are like you, who've been doing this work. And I want to say to you that you're welcome at Mending Minyan. Yes, we are a community that names our values being anti, non-Zionist and diasporist. But I want you to know that you are welcome. By stating our values, we're not saying that you're not welcome. We're just saying this is what we believe in. And if you're open, to being here, to engaging with us, you're so welcome. So thank you for listening. Thank you for engaging, for thinking.
And I want to say that as someone who has been part of this group, I appreciate some of the beautiful and really respectful arguments. I will say I've listened to a couple things where people are definitely arguing, but they're doing it in the most like kind and gentle way, and saying, "Well, I don't know if I really agree with that," or we have a couple people in Mending Minyan who, I don't want to say synagogue hoppers because that sounds not respectful, but who belong to different congregations, which I think is fairly common for folks, at least in New Haven. I know even whole families who are split between maybe 3 different congregations because that there are 3 different kinds of spirituality that they hope to practice. But I will say, yes, thank you so much for staying. If you're not comfortable with this, I echo May. I also want to ask May about this conflation, which you've sort of hinted at or named without saying the word, but of anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism that I have really noticed, especially in the last, I would say I've been very aware of it acutely in the last 5 years, because anti-Semitism is something that is on the rise in the US. And I think that's very scary. But anti-Zionism isn't specifically the same thing, right? And so I'm wondering for you, how to push back against that if someone's also listening and thinking, oh, I heard something and I was told that it was anti-Semitic, but it wasn't actually anti-Semitic. It was anti-Zionist.
Yeah, I think it's really important for us to name, as you are, that anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism are 2 very different things, and that I am a Jew and I am anti-Zionist. I'm told otherwise all the time, but just as if you were critical of the United States, does that make you? I don't know. I'm not gonna flesh out this analogy, but just being critical of something doesn't make you whatever the equivalent of of anti-Semitic is. And I will acknowledge that there is anti-Semitism on the left and on the right, and I think we at Mending Minyan and in the organizing that I do outside, we do try to call out when we see anti-Semitism. So I don't want to say that doesn't exist, but to say that all anti-Zionists and that the ideology of anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism or is anti-Semitic is just way too broad strokes of a statement, and it's not true.
Yeah, and I will say I'm coming at this as a writer so we have and we'll talk about this because it leads into high holidays, but we are so lucky that right next to New Haven in Woodbridge, Connecticut, we have the Palestine Museum, and it is an incredible collection of Palestinian art, including by artists really across the Palestinian diaspora. So first of all, if you haven't checked out that museum as an arts nerd, like go, please, please, please go there. They were physically closed for a little while because of the pandemic, but they've been reopened for quite some time. But I will say, as a writer who has covered their work, inevitably I hear from someone who says, one, this museum should be like closed down, or two, how dare you be so anti-Semitic? And it's hard for me. It's hard for me when I hear from those people, because I want to say this museum not only has a right to exist, but the stories that artists are telling often through their work are extremely powerful. And to say that this museum is just one big anti-Semitic statement is to silence them in a way that I find like hurtful and violent. So yes, and so that does lead into high holidays, which I think Mending Minyan very much invites people who might be, I don't know, Mending Minyan curious to participate in.
Yeah. High holidays are just around the corner in about 2 months. We will be observing Rosh Hashanah, and we will be observing both Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur inside the walls of the Palestine Museum US, which is very exciting. We're very grateful to Faisal and to the Palestine Museum for having us in that space. And I just want to say that I think that speaks to the work we're doing, that we're seeing each other, we're collaborating. We're not doing this work in a silo. We're doing this work in collaboration with Palestinians locally, with the Palestine Museum here and beyond, and thinking critically about how to be in solidarity with Palestinians as we do this work. It's very exciting to be using that space, and it's very complicated. And I don't want to shy away from that. So just this past Wednesday, we began a series of community conversations in which we're talking about what does it mean to be an anti-Zionist synagogue? How do we make sure that we're really in accountability and in solidarity with Palestinians, not just in what we say, but in our actions? And the third question that I think we're starting to wrestle with is, really figuring out that intersection of the political and the spiritual. But so something that I'm thinking about is on Rosh Hashanah, you blow the shofar, you blow the ram's horn. And that's a sound that's used to evict Palestinians from their homes. So are we going to be blowing a shofar in the walls of the Palestinian Museum, where Palestinians may be around, or Palestinians may hear that sound that may be triggering? So there are questions like these that are very live for us. And I think this takes us back to when I was talking about, how do we uncouple Judaism from Zionism? So part of the studying that I'm doing recently is to be like, okay, what does the shofar represent? What is that sound supposed to do to us? And is there another sound? Is there another way that we can have the experience that the shofar is supposed to invoke in us without using an instrument that might be triggering to Palestinians? And I think this is the playground for me. Like this is the space where I really have fun. And it's so cool to be, to be able to do that in the space and with the support and with the collaboration of the Palestine Museum.
Yeah, I love that you describe it as a playground. I just really love that. And so I also wonder within this question of how political do we want to be? I think Mending Minyan, it's safe to say, has a social justice mission, or is tied to a social justice mission. And I'm curious also, knowing you've only been here for 2 months, what that also means within the context of New Haven, and not only hyperlocal organizing, but some of the issues plaguing New Haven, because New Haven is an incredible city, but it is also a city that is very much hurting. And I would say there are a lot of pain points that you can sort of put on historically redlined neighborhoods, especially in this city?
Yeah, I think as a social justice org, and I think as an anti-Zionist group in particular, that means that we are attuned to and involved in the other issues that, as you say, plague our city. And many of our members, of our congregants, of our community members, are activists and are leaders in this community on many issues. And so I think that intersection is just really alive. You know, as I said before, I think when we state our values, we create safety. And when we state that we're anti-Zionist, we're stating that we're an anti-racist community too. And we explicitly say that, but I think it's also inherently there. And, you know, I've been trying to get involved with the work in supporting Randy Cox in New Haven, and I was at the town hall a few weeks ago. And yeah, I feel really excited to tap in locally. I'm getting involved with tenants organizing with a local DSA chapter, and I'm really trying to connect with other community groups and organizers in the city, and for Mending Minyan to also be a part of that, because these issues are totally intersected.
Yeah, yeah, I would absolutely agree with all of that. And just shout out DSA New Haven. Like they are making, I can't use certain 4-letter words because we're still monitored by the FCC, but they are making stuff happen in New Haven. And as someone who cares deeply about housing and believes that everybody, no matter their economic status, deserves safe and affordable housing, it's really exciting to see that work and that organizing happen in New Haven. So May, the last question I usually ask folks is, you know, we're in now the 3rd year of the pandemic, COVID's still with us, even though I've observed that a lot of people don't want to believe that. So what are you doing to also care for yourself, you know, as you care for so many others around you?
Yeah, it's a good question. It's something I think about. It's something I may be not the best at. But, you know, I also think that it takes time to figure out when you're new to a place, right? I have to figure out who my people are, what my resources are. For now, you can probably see me going for lots of walks around the city that I take to recharge, and staying connected to community locally and beyond, and staying connected to comrades and hearing what's going on in their lives. Yeah.
Well, Maggie, I want to thank you so much. You've just been so wonderful. If folks are just tuning in, you've missed a great discussion, but luckily we're on like all of the social platforms, so you can just rewind it and listen and do that thing that people do in the 21st century on computers. But we've been talking about Mending Minyan, a growing and I would just say really beautiful Havurah that is working to decouple Judaism from Zionism. If you're interested in finding out more about Mending Minyan, you can do that pretty easily. On Facebook, it's Mending Minyan. And I don't think there are multiple Mending Minyans, but it's just at Mending Minyan, and you'll get a cute little grayscale image of a needle and thread. And I believe it's just at Mending Minyan also on Instagram. So if you're interested in the work that the group is doing, please just check it out, especially in time for the high holidays. I cannot believe, May, that they are coming up in 2 months. I'm kind of in denial about that because I feel like we were just there. Yeah, but it's a great time, you know, as we enter the Days of Atonement, it is maybe a great time to think about the practice of decoupling Judaism from Zionism. And I'm grateful to have been here in conversation with you and to continue the conversation offline.
Thank you so much, Lucy. And just to plug our website too, mendingminyan.com, where you can find our fundraiser.
Yes, absolutely. There is an ongoing fundraiser. So if you come to a service and you're like, wow, this work really resonates with me, and also I have been meaning to kick a few dollars to a cool organization, boom, there you go. Awesome. May, thank you so much for being with me today.